Constance of Aragon's trembling hands clutched her wedding dress as servants prepared her for the most horrific ceremony in medieval history. Her groom lay waiting in the cathedral, Prince Emeric of Hungary, dead for 3 days and preserved with herbs and alcohol. The stench of his decomposing flesh mixed with frankincense would haunt her for the rest of her life. But backing out wasn't an option. Political alliances demanded their price, even if it meant exchanging vows with a corpse. You won't find this story in most history books. They'll tell you about medieval marriages as romantic tales of chivalry and courtly love. The reality was far more brutal. Noble daughters were chess pieces in a game where human dignity meant nothing compared to territorial control. Constance's wedding day would prove just how far royal families were willing to go to secure power. The year was 1200, and arranged marriages weren't unusual. What happened next would shock even the most hardened medieval courtiers. A 16-year-old girl was about to become the wife of an embalmed prince, surrounded by nobles who pretended this grotesque ritual was perfectly normal. The smell alone made several witnesses faint. Others retched openly as the ceremony continued. This wasn't just political desperation. This was a complete abandonment of basic human decency in pursuit of Hungarian crown lands. Constance's screams echoed through the cathedral as she was forced to kiss lips that had been dead for days. Her family watched from the front pews, counting the potential gold revenues while their daughter's sanity shattered before their eyes. Medieval politics had produced many horrors, but forcing a living woman to marry a rotting corpse crossed every line imaginable. The Hungarian nobles demanded the alliance proceed despite their prince's death. Constance's parents agreed without hesitation. After all, what was one daughter's psychological destruction compared to controlling the Danube trade routes? Born into the House of Aragon in 1179, Constance never had a chance at a normal life. Her father ruled territories stretching across modern Spain, wielding power that came with brutal responsibilities. Royal daughters existed for one purpose: creating alliances through strategic marriages. From childhood, Constance knew her body would be bargained away to strengthen her family's position. The Aragonese court was a viper's nest of ambition where children learned to navigate deadly political currents before they could properly read. Constance grew up watching her father arrange marriages for her sisters, shipping them off to foreign kingdoms like expensive cargo. Each wedding brought new alliances, new territories, new opportunities for expansion. Love was a luxury reserved for peasants. Her education focused on languages, diplomacy, and the subtle art of surviving in foreign courts. Tutors taught her Hungarian customs, preparing her for a life among strangers who would judge her every move. She learned to embroider silk while calculating the political implications of thread colors. Meals became lessons in poison detection and alliance navigation. Medieval chroniclers described Constance as intelligent and beautiful, qualities that made her valuable marriage material. Her dark eyes held a sharpness that impressed visiting ambassadors. She could discuss Hungarian succession laws and Aragonese trade agreements with equal fluency. These skills would prove useless when faced with marrying a decomposing corpse. Court life revolved around marriages that treated human beings like livestock. Daughters were evaluated based on their childbearing potential, their family connections, and their ability to survive assassination attempts. Constance watched older nobles arrange matches that would destroy entire kingdoms if the brides died in childbirth. The political mathematics were always ruthless. Her teenage years passed in preparation for an inevitable departure to some distant castle. Servants packed trunks filled with Aragonese silks and gold, dowry payments that would buy her husband's loyalty to her father's cause. She practiced Hungarian phrases while wondering if her future spouse would be kind or cruel. Death hadn't occurred to her as a possibility. The proposal from Hungary arrived when Constance was 19. Prince Emeric sought a Spanish alliance to strengthen his position against rival claimants to the Hungarian throne. His representatives praised his military victories and his generous treatment of previous diplomatic marriages. They painted a picture of a knight prince who valued Spanish culture and contributions. Negotiations stretched across months as both sides calculated advantages. Hungary offered access to Central European markets and military support against French expansion. Aragon brought Mediterranean naval power and connections to Italian banking families. The marriage would create a power bloc stretching from the Pyrenees to the Carpathian Mountains. Constance had no voice in these discussions. Marriage contracts were signed while she embroidered in her chambers, creating elaborate tapestries that would decorate her future home. Her father's ambassadors reported Emeric's enthusiasm for the match. The prince had specifically requested portraits of his bride and sent gifts of Hungarian furs and jewelry. Contemporary accounts describe the excitement surrounding this alliance. Both courts prepared elaborate celebrations that would demonstrate their combined wealth and power. Hungarian nobles planned tournaments and feasts lasting weeks. Aragonese craftsmen created wedding gifts that would impress the most sophisticated European courts with their artistry and expense. The political benefits seemed enormous. Emeric controlled vast territories rich in silver mines and fertile agricultural land. His armies had proven themselves in recent campaigns against Ottoman raiders. Most importantly, he was young and healthy with excellent prospects for producing heir who could inherit both Hungarian and Aragonese claims. Wedding preparations consumed both kingdoms for months. Seamstresses created elaborate gowns incorporating Spanish lace and Hungarian embroidery. Cooks planned menus featuring delicacies from both cultures. Musicians composed songs celebrating the union of two great royal houses. Nobody suspected the nightmare that was approaching. Hungarian messengers carried regular updates about Prince Emeric's health and activities. He led hunting expeditions and attended court functions with apparent vigor. Plans proceeded smoothly as both families anticipated a ceremony that would reshape European power balances. Constance's departure for Hungary was scheduled for late spring, allowing time for proper travel through potentially dangerous territories. The marriage represented everything medieval politics valued: strategic thinking, dynastic planning, and complete disregard for individual human happiness. What happened next would expose the absolute moral bankruptcy of a system that treated royal daughters as expendable political tools. You think political alliances are complicated today? Emeric, Crown Prince of Hungary, had just days left before becoming Constance's husband when death came for him without warning. No dramatic battle wounds, no heroic last charge, just the sudden brutal reality that claimed so many in medieval times before they reached 30. The Hungarian court erupted into chaos. Royal physicians who had pronounced the prince healthy mere weeks earlier now stood helplessly over his cooling body. Messengers rode frantically between kingdoms, their horses foaming at the mouth as they carried news that would reshape the political landscape of Europe. The most powerful marriage alliance of the decade had just crumbled to dust. But here's what separates medieval politics from anything we understand today. Death wasn't enough to break a contract. The union between Aragon and Hungary represented years of careful negotiation, trade agreements worth fortunes, and military promises that could determine who lived or died in future conflicts. Emeric's father, King Bela III of Hungary, had invested too much to watch his kingdom's future dissolve because his son couldn't stay alive long enough to say wedding vows. Constance received the news while final preparations were being made for her wedding dress. Royal seamstresses were still adjusting the intricate embroidery when word arrived that her future husband was now a corpse. Any normal family might have offered condolences, canceled the festivities, and negotiated new terms. The House of Aragon was not a normal family. Royal advisors gathered in emergency sessions that lasted through the night. Candlelight flickered across faces twisted with calculation as they weighed options that would horrify modern sensibilities. Breaking the alliance meant returning the substantial dowry, forfeiting trade privileges, and potentially facing Hungarian military retaliation. More importantly, it meant admitting that the House of Aragon couldn't honor its commitments, a reputation that could destroy future diplomatic opportunities. The Hungarian delegation, already en route to the wedding, carried their own impossible burden. They had traveled hundreds of miles with gifts, witnesses, and expectations of a celebration that would secure their kingdom's western borders. Returning home empty-handed would signal weakness to neighboring enemies, who were always watching for signs of internal collapse. Medieval chroniclers record that Constance's father, King Alfonso II of Aragon, made his decision with the cold pragmatism that defined successful medieval rulers. The marriage contract had been signed, the dowry paid, and the political necessities remained unchanged. His daughter's feelings about marrying a dead man simply didn't factor into calculations that affected entire populations. The most twisted part, both families convinced themselves they were being honorable. They were fulfilling sacred oaths, maintaining diplomatic integrity, and proving their reliability as partners. The fact that this reliability required a living woman to wed rotting flesh was just the price of medieval statecraft. Constance learned her fate not through gentle persuasion but through royal decree. There would be no escape, no alternative suitors, no time for grief or adjustment. The wedding would proceed as planned, with one small modification that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The ceremony that followed makes horror movies look restrained by comparison. Emeric's body, hastily embalmed with whatever preservation techniques 12th century Hungarian physicians could manage, was dressed in full royal regalia and propped upright in the cathedral. The sweet, sick smell of decay mixed with frankincense and myrrh, creating an atmosphere that sent several witnesses staggering toward the doors. Medieval embalming was less science and more desperate hope. Court physicians packed the prince's body cavities with salt, wine-soaked herbs and aromatic oils that did little to stop decomposition in the summer heat. The process took precious hours while wedding guests waited in growing horror, some undoubtedly wondering if they were witnessing a royal marriage or an elaborate funeral. Constance walked down the aisle in her carefully crafted wedding dress to meet a groom whose skin had already taken on the waxy pallor of death. His eyes were closed, his hands folded across his chest, and his face bore the artificial serenity that embalmers tried to create but rarely achieved. She stood beside him as priests read vows that had been written for the living, their words echoing strangely in a cathedral that felt more like a tomb. The most obscene detail wasn't the corpse itself, but the pretense of normalcy that everyone maintained. Wedding guests went through the motions of celebration, raising toasts to a bride who was trembling uncontrollably and a groom who would never taste wine again. Musicians played traditional wedding songs while the smell of decomposition grew stronger with each passing hour. Royal witnesses signed documents that legally bound Constance to a dead man, creating a marriage that existed in law but nowhere in nature. The Hungarian delegation got their political alliance, Aragon got their trade agreements, and Constance got a wedding night that would traumatize her for decades to come. The ceremony concluded with a kiss that palace chroniclers described but never detailed, perhaps because no amount of diplomatic necessity could make the reality anything less than grotesque. Contemporary accounts mention that Constance had to be physically supported as she performed this final ritual, her legs shaking so violently that she could barely stand. What makes this even more disturbing is how quickly everyone involved tried to move past what had just happened. The wedding feast continued as planned, with nobles making speeches about eternal love and political friendship while the bride sat in shocked silence and the groom began his slow slide toward complete decay. This wasn't just medieval politics. This was what happened when human beings became chess pieces in games played by people who valued treaties more than basic human dignity. Medieval embalming was less preservation and more theatrical postponement of the inevitable. When Emmerich died, Hungarian court physicians had perhaps 2 days to create the illusion that he was merely sleeping rather than decomposing. The techniques they used would seem primitive and desperate by today's standards, but they represent the cutting edge of 12th century death management. The process began with drainage. Royal physicians made strategic incisions to remove blood and bodily fluids that would accelerate decay. Without modern chemical preservatives, they relied on salt, wine, and aromatic herbs to draw out moisture and mask the smell of death. Rosemary, thyme, and lavender were packed into body cavities, creating a sweet, sick perfume that fooled no one but made the ceremony slightly more bearable for witnesses. Wine played a crucial role in medieval embalming, not because it preserved tissue but because its alcohol content slowed bacterial growth for a few precious days. Royal physicians soaked burial cloths in the strongest wine available, then wrapped the prince's body in layers that were constantly reapplied as decay progressed. The result was less mummification and more controlled decomposition, buying time rather than stopping death. The most challenging aspect was the face. Medieval embalmers had limited understanding of muscle relaxation after death, which meant Emmerich's features would naturally sink and distort within hours. Court physicians used wax, cloth padding, and strategic positioning to maintain the illusion of peaceful sleep. His eyes were sealed shut with wax and his mouth carefully closed with hidden stitching that wouldn't be visible to wedding guests. Temperature control was primitive but essential. The cathedral was kept as cool as possible through strategic ventilation and the liberal use of ice when available. Summer heat was the enemy of every medieval embalmer, accelerating the decay process regardless of how many herbs and oils they applied. The timing of Constance's wedding ceremony was ultimately determined not by political convenience but by how long Emmerich's body could maintain a semblance of human dignity. The aromatic component of medieval embalming served multiple purposes beyond masking decay. Myrrh, frankincense, and other expensive spices were believed to have spiritual significance, helping the deceased soul transition to the afterlife. They were also thought to have medical properties that could slow decomposition, though this belief was based more on hope than scientific understanding. Royal embalmers worked around the clock in the days leading up to the wedding, constantly reapplying preservatives and adjusting their techniques as decay progressed. They were fighting a battle they knew they couldn't win, trying to maintain the illusion of life long enough for political necessity to be served. The pressure was enormous. Failure meant not just professional disgrace but potential diplomatic catastrophe. The final result was a grotesque compromise between death and ceremony. Emeric's body looked peaceful from a distance but couldn't withstand close inspection. Wedding guests who had to approach the altar reported the unmistakable reality of death. The waxy skin texture, the artificial positioning, and the overwhelming smell of decay mixed with spices that created its own nauseating perfume. The embalmed corpse of Prince Emeric wasn't just Constance's nightmare, it was her family's golden opportunity. While she stood trembling before a dead man's preserved remains, her relatives were already counting the political dividends. The House of Aragon had invested years negotiating this Hungarian alliance, and no amount of human decency was going to derail their ambitions now. You need to understand how medieval noble families operated. They weren't just bloodlines, they were calculated political machines where every member served as a chess piece in an endless game of territorial expansion. Constance's father and his advisors had spent months crafting treaties, dowry agreements, and territorial concessions with Hungary. The paperwork alone represented thousands of gold pieces in scribal work, diplomatic missions, and ceremonial preparations. Prince Emeric's inconvenient death wasn't going to waste that investment. The cold mathematics of dynasty building reveal themselves in palace records from this period. Marriage contracts weren't romantic promises. They were complex legal documents outlining military support, trade agreements, and succession rights that could span generations. The Aragonese court had already received Hungarian gold as part of the betrothal agreement. Breaking the alliance now meant returning those funds, plus facing massive penalties for breach of international treaty. More devastating still, it would signal to every neighboring kingdom that Aragon couldn't honor its commitments. Constance's protests, if she even dared voice them, carried zero weight against these calculations. Medieval noble daughters existed as diplomatic currency, their personal wishes entirely irrelevant to family strategy. Her relatives likely viewed her horror at marrying a corpse as childish squeamishness that needed to be overcome for the greater good. Palace advisors probably argued that other princesses had endured far worse for their families. At least she wasn't being sold to an enemy who might torture or murder her. The most chilling aspect wasn't the family's ruthlessness but their complete inability to comprehend why anyone would hesitate. To them, Constance was fulfilling her predetermined role exactly as intended. The fact that her groom happened to be dead was merely a technical detail that didn't alter the fundamental political equations at stake. Hungarian territories would still align with Aragonese interests. Trade routes would still open. Military partnerships would still activate when needed. Contemporary court documents reveal how thoroughly noble families prioritized dynastic advancement over individual welfare. Parents routinely married off children to secure alliances, often never seeing those daughters again after they departed for foreign courts. Death during childbirth was accepted as an occupational hazard of noble womanhood. Forced marriages to abusive or mentally unstable partners were standard diplomatic practice. Against this backdrop, Constance's situation seemed merely unusual rather than fundamentally wrong. The truly horrifying realization is that her family probably congratulated themselves on their creative problem-solving. They had transformed a potential diplomatic disaster into a successful alliance completion. That their solution traumatized a 19-year-old girl for life never factored into their assessment. Success was measured in territorial gains and political stability, not in psychological well-being or basic human compassion. When Constance's relatives looked at that grotesque ceremonial scene, they saw triumph. When she looked at it, she saw the moment her family sacrificed her sanity on the altar of their ambitions. The grotesque wedding ceremony didn't end when the last priest finished his prayers. It carved itself permanently into Constance's psyche, creating wounds that would never heal. While her family celebrated their diplomatic victory, she began a lifelong battle against trauma that medieval medicine couldn't understand, let alone treat. Medieval chroniclers weren't equipped to document psychological damage the way modern observers might, but the scattered references to Constance's later behavior paint a devastating picture. She reportedly suffered from recurring nightmares where she relived the ceremony repeatedly, waking in terror as she remembered the cold texture of Emeric's preserved skin during the ritual hand-joining. Sleep became her enemy rather than refuge, turning every night into another confrontation with that horrific day. The isolation was perhaps even more destructive than the initial trauma. How do you explain to anyone that you were forced to kiss a dead man's lips as part of your marriage vows? Medieval society had no framework for processing such an experience, leaving Constance trapped alone with memories too disturbing to share. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed her increasing withdrawal from court social functions, her reluctance to discuss marriage prospects, and her visible distress whenever conversation turned to wedding customs or ceremonies. Physical symptoms accompanied the psychological devastation in ways that medieval observers attributed to various ailments. Court physicians noted her chronic insomnia, her reluctance to eat at formal banquets, and what we might now recognize as panic attacks during religious services. The sight of ceremonial candles or the smell of preservation herbs used in royal rituals could trigger overwhelming anxiety episodes that left her gasping and trembling. Most tragically, the forced marriage destroyed Constance's ability to form normal romantic relationships for the rest of her life. Historical records suggest she refused multiple subsequent marriage proposals despite enormous family pressure to accept politically advantageous matches. The thought of another wedding ceremony, even with a living groom, apparently triggered such severe distress that her relatives eventually stopped pressing the issue. Her relationship with religious faith also suffered permanent damage. The perverted wedding ceremony had taken place in a consecrated space, with legitimate priests performing sacred rites over a corpse. This grotesque mixing of holy sacrament with macabre political theater created a complex spiritual trauma that haunted her relationship with the church throughout her remaining years. She reportedly avoided attending weddings for other family members, claiming sudden illnesses that coincidentally arose whenever ceremonial celebrations were planned. The cruelest aspect of Constance's psychological torment was how it reinforced itself over time. Each nightmare made the next day more difficult to endure. Each avoided social situation increased her isolation. Each refused marriage proposal reminded her family of her failure to move past the incident and fulfill her continuing dynastic obligations. She was trapped in a cycle where healing was impossible because the very act of trying to live normally triggered renewed trauma. Medieval medical knowledge offered no relief for what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. There were no therapists to help her process the experience, no medications to ease her anxiety, and no social understanding that her reactions were normal responses to an abnormal situation. Instead, she was expected to simply continue functioning as if nothing unusual had occurred, carrying her psychological wounds in complete solitude until they eventually destroyed her capacity for happiness entirely. Medieval society's reaction to Constance's bizarre wedding revealed the enormous gap between noble expectations and basic human decency. The response split sharply along class lines, with aristocrats defending the ceremony as necessary statecraft while common people reacted with horror and disgust that such a thing could happen under God's watch. Among the nobility, the dominant reaction was grudging admiration for the House of Aragon's diplomatic creativity. Court chroniclers from other kingdoms noted the wedding in their records with the same detached tone they used for describing treaty negotiations or territorial exchanges. To them, this was simply an extreme but understandable example of dynastic duty overcoming personal preferences. Several noble families quietly discussed whether similar arrangements might solve their own diplomatic complications when death disrupted carefully planned alliances. The Church's official response was carefully neutral, focusing on technical theological questions rather than moral outrage. Religious authorities confirmed that the ceremony was legally valid under canon law, since the marriage vows had been spoken correctly and the union properly witnessed. They avoided addressing whether forcing a living woman to marry a corpse violated any spiritual principles, instead treating the entire event as an unusual but acceptable application of existing marriage doctrine. However, the common people's reaction was entirely different and far more human. Peasants and merchants who heard whispered accounts of the ceremony were genuinely revolted by what they considered an act of fundamental blasphemy against both divine will and natural order. Folk tales began circulating that portrayed the wedding as evidence of noble corruption, with storytellers adding increasingly gruesome details about the decomposing groom and the weeping bride. Religious sentiment among ordinary believers ran strongly against the ceremony, viewing it as the kind of perverted abuse of sacred rites that invited divine punishment. Village priests, unlike their diplomatic counterparts in royal courts, spoke privately about the spiritual dangers of mixing death with marriage sacraments. This grassroots religious opposition created an underground narrative that the House of Aragon had committed a grave sin that would eventually bring catastrophic consequences. Foreign kingdoms watched the incident with fascination and calculation rather than moral judgment. Rival dynasties used the story as propaganda, claiming it proved their enemies' desperation and moral bankruptcy. Allied kingdoms stayed diplomatically silent while privately questioning whether the Aragonese court had finally gone too far in their pursuit of political advantage. The most telling reactions came from other noble daughters throughout medieval Europe who recognized that Constance's fate could easily become their own if family ambitions demanded such sacrifice. Court ladies whispered among themselves with a mixture of sympathy for Constance and terror that their own relatives might someday make similar demands. These conversations rarely reached historical records, but they represented the clearest contemporary understanding that something fundamentally wrong had occurred. Years later, as word of the ceremony spread through diplomatic channels and traveling merchants' gossip, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked dynastic ambition. However, the lesson most nobles drew wasn't that such arrangements were morally wrong. Instead, they concluded that the House of Aragon— here's the disturbing truth about one of history's most horrific forced marriages— most of what you've heard is either exaggerated folklore or complete fabrication. The real story of Constance of Aragon is buried under centuries of sensationalized retellings that transformed genuine medieval brutality into Gothic horror fiction. Medieval chroniclers weren't exactly known for their restraint when describing shocking events. Court records from the period show they often embellished details to emphasize the moral lessons they wanted to convey. What started as political commentary about dynastic excess became increasingly theatrical with each retelling. By the time these accounts reached modern historians, the line between documented fact and dramatic interpretation had completely vanished. The most persistent myth claims that Constance's wedding ceremony lasted for hours, with elaborate rituals involving the embalmed corpse of Prince Emeric. Contemporary sources suggest something far more clinical occurred. Medieval marriage contracts could be fulfilled through symbolic gestures rather than full ceremonial pageantry. The actual event likely involved minimal ritual, just enough legal formality to satisfy the alliance requirements between Aragon and Hungary. Another fabrication involves the supposed crowd of horrified witnesses who watched this macabre union unfold. Historical evidence points to a much smaller private affair. Medieval nobility understood the political necessity behind such arrangements, even when they found them distasteful. The handful of people present would have been carefully selected family members and legal witnesses, not a theater audience gasping in horror. The most dangerous myth suggests that such ceremonies were common practice in medieval Europe. This is absolutely false. While political marriages involving deceased betrothed occurred occasionally, they remained extraordinary exceptions that shocked even contemporary observers. These weren't routine solutions to diplomatic problems but desperate measures taken when enormous political stakes demanded extreme action. Modern dramatizations love depicting Constance as a helpless victim dragged screaming to an altar. The reality shows a young woman trapped by the same political system that governed every aspect of noble life. She understood her duty as clearly as she understood the personal cost. Medieval princesses weren't naive about the transactional nature of their marriages, even when those transactions became grotesquely literal. Some accounts claim the embalmed body was dressed in wedding finery and positioned to appear lifelike. Medieval embalming techniques weren't sophisticated enough to create such theatrical displays. The preservation methods available would have produced something far more obviously deceased, making any pretense of normal ceremony impossible to maintain. The lasting damage these myths cause goes beyond simple historical inaccuracy. They transform a genuine human tragedy into entertainment, reducing Constance's suffering to a Gothic curiosity. The real horror wasn't supernatural or theatrical but brutally mundane, a political system so ruthless that human dignity became completely expendable when dynastic interests were at stake. Separating fact from fiction reveals something more disturbing than any embellished tale. The documented reality shows how medieval power structures could systematically destroy individual lives without anyone involved thinking they were doing anything particularly unusual. That calculated indifference to human suffering proves more chilling than any ghost story ever could. When you strip away the sensationalized details, what remains is a starker truth about how political necessity could overwhelm basic human decency. This systematic dehumanization wasn't the exception but the rule for medieval nobility, making Constance's fate both unique in its specifics and tragically representative of her era. Constance of Aragon's story stands as one of history's most brutal examples of political ambition consuming human dignity. Her forced marriage to Prince Emeric's corpse wasn't an isolated act of medieval madness but the logical extreme of a system that treated royal women as expendable diplomatic tools. The aftermath haunted her for decades. Contemporary accounts describe a woman fundamentally changed by her experience, withdrawn from court life and reportedly suffering what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. She never remarried, despite multiple political advantages that subsequent unions could have provided her family. The woman who survived that grotesque ceremony spent the rest of her life as a living reminder of dynastic politics taken to their most inhuman extreme. Her case illuminates the broader machinery of medieval power that ground up individual lives without hesitation. Every princess of the era understood that marriage meant serving as a human treaty, but Constance's experience pushed that transactional reality into territory so disturbing that even her contemporaries struggled to justify it. Yet justify it they did, because the alternative meant admitting that their entire political system rested on systematic cruelty. The Hungarian-Aragonese alliance survived long enough to serve its intended purpose, strengthening both kingdoms' positions in the complex web of medieval European politics. From a purely strategic perspective, the forced ceremony succeeded completely. The human cost was deemed acceptable collateral damage by rulers who measured success in territorial gains and diplomatic advantage rather than personal suffering. Modern parallels exist in subtler forms throughout history, wherever political necessity has been allowed to override basic human rights. Constance's story serves as an extreme cautionary tale about what happens when institutions become so focused on their own preservation that they lose sight of the people they're supposed to serve. The documentation surrounding her case also reveals how medieval society compartmentalized moral outrage. The same nobles who privately expressed horror at the forced marriage continued participating in a system that made such abuses inevitable. They understood the logical endpoint of treating people as political assets yet lacked either the will or power to change the underlying structures. What makes Constance's fate particularly tragic is how preventable it was. Alternative arrangements existed that could have preserved the alliance without subjecting her to such trauma. The decision to proceed with the corpse ceremony reflected not political necessity but a failure of imagination and basic humanity among the people controlling her life. Her legacy challenges comfortable assumptions about historical progress. We like to believe that civilization has steadily become more humane, but Constance's story suggests that institutional cruelty simply evolves rather than disappears. The methods change, while the fundamental willingness to sacrifice individual human dignity for larger goals remains disturbingly consistent across centuries. The princess who was forced to marry a dead man ultimately teaches us that the distance between medieval barbarism and modern civilization may be shorter than we want to believe. Her suffering demands that we remain vigilant about protecting individual dignity against institutional power, regardless of how noble the stated goals might be.